And this is before I even had my hands on Leo or the synthesizers that I finally got a chance to do. ARP was my first synthesizer, ARP, um, and Alan R. Perlman. And I'm on actually his daughter. He passed away a few years ago, and his daughter started the foundation, the Alan R. Perlman Foundation, to preserve his legacy.
Mm.
And she asked me to be on the board, so I feel really happy to do that. But that was my first synthesizer, 2600, and
Wow.
soloist, and then finally the pro soloist. In fact, the pro soloist is in Leo.
Oh, wow.
I I took all the stuff that I had and combined it so I could play it all
Mm.
in a more organized fashion.
Yeah.
Can Yeah, so the whole concept of Leo, taking all these different keyboards and synthesizers and putting them together so you have access to all these different sounds. So to to someone's ear, I feel you have to be or you coming up and being exposed to your first synthesizer being the ARP. So what was your reasoning for combining all of these? Was it because there was unique tones that you wanted in the sound palette, but you couldn't get only playing one keyboard at a time?
Yeah, that sounds like the most logical explanation. But man, I was winging it. It was not a plan that I felt like if I put this and this together, I'm going to come up with all of these sounds. No, just put them together and see what I come up with.
Mm.
I didn't have any expectations of what it was supposed to do. So it's almost like playing jazz. I mean, you might have an idea, but when you're playing jazz or doing improv, you just never know what's going to come out when you're playing with other folks. And that was the fun in it. That's where, to me, the music is the most incredible experience.
Mm.
It's all the things that, I mean, you may, like I said, you may have a roadmap, but you might once in a while want to veer off to the side, take a side step here. And so putting Leo together was sort of like that. I had all of this stuff, but it was all spread out, and it was hard for me to play every night with my hands stuck out like this. So I wanted to have things as much in front of me.
Mm.
So I wanted those keyboards in front. I still have a few ancillary things. I had a vocoder on the side and and JP4 on this side, but for the most part, I'm playing the three keyboards in front.
Mm.
And the pedal board. And the pedal board was connected to a ProMars Roland second synthesizer that they came out with, analog synthesizer. Their first one was called the JP4 or Jupiter 4.
Oh, right.
And I helped, the Jupiter 4, that was my baby. I programmed the sounds, the presets on that.
Those are very expensive nowadays, huh?
Oh man, all that analog stuff is expensive now.
Right, right. Well, I
It's
think
because it's gotten old.
right. That's a good thing. But yeah, I think Leo is such a fascinating instrument because of how pioneering it was, 10 years before MIDI. But also even just the name, like I think that could be a good format for our conversation live, your experience playing playing in San Francisco and in Carnegie Hall. We'll definitely dive into that. Electronics, all your engineer brain that you were talking about that you developed as a kid and really gave you a lot of opportunities that a lot of musicians don't really think of. But then the third word is kind of stuck out to me, because orchestra, live electronic orchestra, because when I think somebody of our generation thinks of synthesizers, we think of like 80s synth pop, we think of like film scoring, we think of like very contemporary uses of synthesizers, but your first inspiration was Bach. Wendy. What's her? What's the full name?
Carlos,
Carlos.
Wendy Carlos,
R-
Carlos.
Yeah, and that whole album of synth Bach, and it
Yeah.
seems like it wasn't. People didn't really know what to make of synthesizers at this point. They weren't like, oh, we're gonna make music that sounds like this. Like people were trying classical music out on it. They were
hmm
trying whatever. Can you describe this this state where synthesizers, this period where synthesizers were just coming out, and how this was embraced by the classical community, and why that didn't really tend to catch on?
Well, I think for one thing, as I stated before, it took her 2 years in a studio. And when you're doing stuff in a studio, not necessarily can you do that when you get on stage.
Mm.
It was one person.
Right.
It was one person. It wasn't an ensemble. And so to duplicate that, she would have probably had to have about 3 or 4 different musicians with her to play these lines if they were to do it live.
Mm.
And so I think that was one of the reasons. The other thing, I think it caught, people really sometimes we get hung up about where we think the proper place for an idea is. If it's a traditional sense of using the word orchestra, so to speak.
Mm.
Orchestra, normally you think you know what it looks like.
Right.
A band, you know what it looks like. But when you started to talk about synthesizers, what is that going to look like? You got a bunch of knobs and sliders and things like that. And then you're talking about textures. And for me, the orchestra, I think I came up with this. The orchestra to me has always been a radio program that my mom would listen to on Saturdays from the Metropolitan Opera. When I was just a little kid, maybe 4 or 5 years old, Mom would turn on the radio and she wanted to listen to the opera. And of course, we lived in the projects, in Dayton, Ohio. So she didn't turn the radio up as loud as she normally would turn it up, because she didn't want her neighbors to think that she was snooty or something.
Wow. That's some real stuff.
And so I remember those earliest impressions of listening to the libretto, the summation and the beginning, the radio announcers. I can't remember his name, but he had this wonderful voice. He could tell his story. And here I'm looking at a radio. I'm looking at the dial on the radio, and in my imagination, it was like a television. I could see that orchestra. I could see not Carnegie Hall, but Metropolitan Opera. And because my ears became my eyes. My ears became my eyes. And I can imagine, this is the stuff that a lot of kids don't get to do anymore, because everything is screen, video, oriented. And so the imagination, to have that time to imagine what these things were. So in the back of my mind, I wanted to be a conductor. In fact, I remember standing up after a few months of learning what this is going to be all about, when Mom would do this on Saturday, when the radio would come on and the orchestra would do the overture, I would stand up and act like I was conducting the orchestra as a little kid. So these are all things that were bubbling around in my mind for many years. I always wanted to be a part, or be a conductor, in fact, of an orchestra. And so when the synthesizer came out, and when I heard what Wendy did, I said, that's an orchestra. It's just different instruments. She's using a different set of instruments. I call the traditional instruments, I call them mechanical synthesizers. What does the word synth means? Man-made, okay? human made, okay? And so those are mechanical synthesizers. And then we came into the electronic synthesizer, and then into the digital synthesizer. But the original synthesizer is the human voice.
Right.
Human made.
Yeah, and when you hear a soloist on a traditional instrument, whether it's violin or saxophone or oboe, and they're playing something very sensitive, it's almost like you're listening to someone singing. And that's what gets us as an audience, because most people have a voice. They know where that's resonant with them. I mean, it's innate, and so they can actually resonate with that sound, and the emotions that come from that.
Wow.
So that's for me. That's what the orchestra was about. And when I heard her do that, then I wanted to take the synthesizers and then put it together so I could actually play it from my fingertips.